A long time ago, 42 years to be exact, a friend invited me to a conference that turned out to be life-changing for me. It was the weekend retreat of the Urban Church Coalition. This was a newly formed organization within Unitarian Universalism. The conference was held on Thompson's Island in Boston Harbor, where we enjoyed some quiet respite away from the demands of daily life, but where we could still hear emergency sirens sounding all over the city. So it was a place set apart, but never completely. And this was in the late 70s, 15 years after Selma, where a large group of UU ministers and lay leaders had gone to march with Dr. King. It was roughly a decade after the UUA empowerment controversy of the late 60s and early 70s, which some of you may have heard of. It was also, it occurs to me, quite a while before Ken Wiley was even born. The coalition was an interracial group of UU ministers and laity, most of whom served urban congregations as professional or lay leaders. As an organization, they had several linked concerns. First, they were concerned about the situation of many of our denomination's urban churches and troubled by the national leadership's apparent indifference to them. Back then, the UUA Extension Department was focusing on churches in the suburbs, and their declared strategy was to reach out to people who looked like those already in the pews. For the most part, this would be affluent white people. And the coalition challenged this approach. They asked, if that's the approach, do we as UUs really have any religious message? The coalition was further disturbed by the predominantly white culture within Unitarian Universalism. This culture, it turns out, didn't get that way by accident. It got that way because for years, denominational leaders deliberately excluded people of color, excluded them from Unitarian and Universalist ministries, from leadership in congregations, and even in some cases from congregations themselves. And it is important, I think, for we UUs to know that history. And perhaps the best place to learn it is through the writings of the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, an African-American minister and scholar who grew up at First Unitarian in Chicago, but now lives in Toronto. Now, the Urban Church Coalition was active for a few years, agitating at general assemblies and other places before its work was taken over by others. And among the people who took over its work were leaders at denominational headquarters. So that was a really good thing. And it is gratifying to see that some seeds planted over 40 years ago have begun to bear fruit. For the UUA has changed since the late 70s and early 80s. There are more UU ministers and religious professionals of color than there were back then, many more. Two of them, the Reverend Bill Sinkford and the Reverend Peter Morales, were elected UUA president. And when problems have arisen, such as the hiring controversy I spoke about 2 weeks ago, the denomination hasn't tried to sweep the problems under the rug, but has responded in some powerful ways. And yet, as my friend Ken Wiley's experience tells us, we are still very much on a journey. Sad to say, Ken's recent experience with his home congregation wasn't unusual. In fact, the findings of the Commission on Institutional Change suggest that his experience is still shared by many UUs of color. In its 3 years of investigation from 2017 to 2020, the commission invited people to submit testimony about their lived experience within Unitarian Universalism. And based on hundreds of responses they received, they concluded that dominant culture UUs continue to repel many of the people who would otherwise provide the resources to fuel our continued growth. Through our predominantly white congregations and organizations may see themselves as welcoming, they continue to mirror the kinds of harms done to people of color and other marginalized groups in our larger society. The commission added, on this note, we stress that when we are inhospitable to one group, others who experience marginalization notice, and our sacred spaces become unwelcoming to them as well. Now, Ken's experience of unwelcome, consisting of distrustful looks from those who didn't know him, is one example. Another is verbal microaggressions, often unintentional, committed by white UUs. And the commission names some of these, asking a person of color, where are you really from? Or telling a Latinx person who was born in the US, you speak English so well. Or assuming a Black person is new to Unitarian Universalism, or insisting on touching the hair of this person's child. Or asking a person who has just come in the door for the first time, welcome, do you want to join the racial justice team? I kid you not, all of these and more have happened in UU congregations. And when they happen, is it any surprise that many of them who experience them come once and then don't return? To counteract incidents like these, the commission has offered a series of recommendations, which include support for caucuses and conferences for UUs of color, and quality leadership training in anti-racism for UUs of all identities. And these are important technical solutions. They should be implemented. But it occurs to me that the really important adaptive change, the mind-boggling change that we have to live into, is reframing our ideas about what welcome is and what hospitality is. And eventually this might lead to reframing our ideas about what it means to do church or be the church. So, hospitality. It's worth noting that the word is derived from the Latin word hospice, meaning visitor or stranger. And before Latin, we had the ancient Greek word philoxenia, which means love of the stranger. In other words, true hospitality encompasses more than having friends over for dinner or serving coffee after worship to people we already know, worthy as those things are. Hospitality is embracing the stranger, extending care to people we don't know, and it's about extending a welcoming arm to a loving arm to people who are different from us, sometimes very different. In a UU context, this includes not only people of different ethnic origins, but also people of different theologies, different ages and generations, different sexual orientations, different gender expressions, different sizes, different economic circumstances. A few weeks ago, when the Reverend Kiyama Rahman was with us, she was asked about building diversity and extending hospitality in predominantly white areas like Livingston County. And I thought her response was on target. Rather than lament the apparent lack of diversity around us, why don't we look for the differences that are right in front of us, but sometimes pass unnoticed? And I was thinking, well, what might those be for CUUB? And I can think of two possibilities. I'm sure there are more. One would be paying attention to economic differences and also to generational differences. In fact, those two sets of differences often coexist in the same families and individuals. At 75, I am an early baby boomer, really a charter member of my generation. And when I was growing up, my family's economic circumstances seemed quite modest. But over the years, I've become acutely aware how privileged suburban white families were back then, even modest ones, mainly because of the economic and political climate in the US after World War II. Gen Xers and millennials grew up in very different worlds, and this is often reflected in their economic circumstances and their approach to religious life. In 2013, I attended a workshop with a Presbyterian minister. She was fairly young then, the Reverend Carol Howard Merritt. And at the time, Reverend Merritt was writing about ministry with adults in their 20s and 30s. With her 40th birthday looming, though, she was on the verge of leaving that cohort. Reverend Carol invited us to consider a hypothetical young adult, unmarried, looking for a spiritual home. She invited us to imagine that this young person is still building a first life structure for themselves and doesn't yet know where they'll settle, if they do. Because of this, they are not in a position to make a forever commitment to a committee or to take on a big volunteer job. They may not be prepared even to make a modest pledge. And for people in this young adult's position, cultural assumptions in churches can be very oppressive. These folk will be very sensitive to cultural shaming from some older members who expect them to see church the same way it's been seen in the past. And yet, here is this young adult right in our midst, longing for connection, longing for a spiritual home. And this person may or may not care whether there are many young people their age at the church. What they will notice and care about is this: how are they received? Are they welcomed warmly for themselves? Are they embraced as a person of inherent worth and dignity? Or will they be valued or not only for how useful they are to the congregation's agenda, the agenda already in place? What can they contribute to the budget, for instance? Or how many volunteer hours can they offer? To this person and to anyone who's a stranger in our midst, we have the opportunity to extend hospitality from the heart. And this could have many facets. As we begin to emerge from our 2-year quarantine, it's a great time to envision new ideas, new possibilities. And one place to start might be to turn away from the assumptions we tend to make about people and what they need, what they're looking for. Turning away from assumptions and learning instead to ask questions, interested questions instead, about what folks think, about what they need. The Reverend Leslie Takahashi, who chaired the Commission on Institutional Change, puts it this way, and I'll close with her words. Perhaps it is to practice questioning more than answering, listening more than questioning, learning more than knowing or think we know. Perhaps it is to drag out a slightly unordered collection of truths into our tidy sanctuaries on Sunday mornings and not be afraid if the whole mess isn't detangled 2,000 words later. Perhaps it is being there to say, I don't know the answer, but I will still be with you in your pain, and not shunning those whose complexities defy our easy molds. Personally, I find solace in learning from those who live in this complexity on a daily basis and letting their wisdom be a guide. Perhaps it is to honor that those who came before us and those who lead now and those who will come after us all bear truths, and that all of these truths are still worth carrying. So may it be.